On the morning of January 28, 1986, the world watched as the Space Shuttle STS-51L lifted off from Kennedy Space Center under a clear blue sky. 73 seconds later, that sky was torn apart by a branching plume of smoke and flame that would become one of the most indelible images in modern history. The vehicle, known to millions as Space Shuttle Challenger, appeared to explode in a blinding flash. Television commentators struggled for words. In homes and classrooms across America, disbelief turned into horror. Almost immediately, a narrative formed: an instantaneous explosion, a sudden and merciful end. It was a version of events that offered a small measure of comfort amid catastrophe. Yet, as the shock faded and investigators began the painstaking work of reconstruction, a far more complex and deeply unsettling picture began to emerge from telemetry data, recovered debris, and forensic analysis. The term explosion became shorthand for what happened, but technically it obscures the physics of the event. Challenger was not destroyed by a single, all-consuming detonation that vaporized everything in its path. Instead, a failure in the right solid rocket booster's O-ring allowed a jet of flame to escape and impinge upon the external tank. When the liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen tanks ruptured, the resulting release of propellant created a massive fireball. But it was not a classic high-order explosive blast. The orbiter was torn apart by overwhelming aerodynamic forces as it traveled at nearly Mach 2 through dense lower atmosphere. Wings, payload bay, and main engines disintegrated under stress. But the crew cabin, the most structurally reinforced section of the shuttle, separated largely intact from the rest of the vehicle. High-speed tracking footage later revealed the cabin emerging from the expanding cloud and continuing upward on its own ballistic arc, a silent capsule carrying 7 human beings into a separate and far more tragic timeline. Inside that compartment were Commander Dick Scobie, Pilot Michael Smith, Mission Specialist Judith Resnick, Ellison Onisuka, Ronald McNair, Payload Specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Teacher in Space Krista McAuliffe. For decades, public memory fixed their fate at the 73rd second. Yet recovered evidence complicated that assumption. When divers later retrieved the shattered cabin from the Atlantic seabed, they found that several personal egress air packs, emergency oxygen devices not tied to the shuttle's primary life support, had been manually activated. These packs did not engage automatically. They required deliberate action. The activation of multiple units strongly suggested that at least some crew members were conscious after the breakup. Additional forensic examination of the cockpit revealed circuit breakers in altered positions, particularly near the pilot's station. These switches were shielded against accidental movement. Their repositioning indicated purposeful human effort, consistent with a trained aviator attempting to restore electrical power or regain control in an unfolding emergency. The implications were profound. If the cabin did not immediately depressurize, and if oxygen packs were functioning, then the occupants may have remained alive during the ballistic ascent and subsequent descent. After separating at roughly 48,000 feet, the cabin continued upward, reaching an estimated apogee near 65,000 feet before gravity reversed its motion. For approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds, it fell back toward Earth. During this interval, gravitational forces fluctuated but did not consistently exceed levels known to cause instant loss of consciousness in trained astronauts. The compartment had no parachute system and no independent flight capability. It was never designed to survive alone. What had been a spacecraft became an uncontrolled projectile. Whether the crew retained awareness for the entire descent cannot be known with absolute certainty, but the physical evidence does not support an immediate, painless end at the moment of breakup. NASA's official communications reflected caution. The Rogers Commission focused primarily on technical causes, the O-ring design, decision-making failures, and contractor oversight at Morton Thiokol. In public briefings, agency representatives often used measured language, stating that the cause of death could not be conclusively determined. The emphasis on engineering failure was appropriate and necessary for reform, yet it also had the effect of narrowing public attention to mechanical flaws rather than human experience. The haunting possibility of a prolonged descent of 7 astronauts confronting a situation with no avenue of escape remain largely absent from collective memory. The image of the branching smoke plume eclipsed the quieter, more disturbing reality of the intact cabin's trajectory. When the crew compartment finally struck the Atlantic Ocean at an estimated speed exceeding 200 miles per hour, the impact forces were catastrophic. At such velocity, water behaves like an unyielding surface. The structural integrity that had preserved the cabin during breakup could not withstand that collision. Recovery operations conducted by the United States Navy lasted weeks and were carried out with solemn discretion. The remains of the crew were identified and returned to their families. The cabin and other debris were ultimately stored in a secured location at Cape Canaveral, sealed away from public view. This physical burial mirrored, in some respects, the emotional containment of the most troubling aspects of the disaster. Yet the legacy of those 165 seconds did not vanish. In the aftermath, NASA implemented sweeping changes. Shuttle escape procedures were revised, pressure suits were redesigned, and later missions incorporated more robust contingency planning. The culture within the agency shifted toward greater openness regarding descent and risk assessment. The tragedy of STS-51L became a case study in organizational decision-making under pressure, influencing not only aerospace engineering but industries worldwide. Every subsequent improvement in crew safety carried an unspoken acknowledgement of what had been lost. Remembering the Challenger disaster in full context does not diminish the heroism of those aboard. If anything, it deepens it. The possibility that crew members attempted to activate oxygen supplies or restore power in their final moments speaks not of despair but of training, discipline, and resolve. They acted as astronauts until the very end. Exploration has always demanded courage in the face of uncertainty. The 7 aboard Challenger understood the risks inherent in pushing beyond Earth's atmosphere. Their mission was not undertaken lightly. They flew because expanding human knowledge and presence in space was, and remains, a venture of profound significance. Today, when we recall the plume against the Florida sky, we should also remember the fuller reality of structural breakup. Rather than simple explosion of an intact cabin tracing a silent arc of evidence that suggests effort and awareness. History is most honest when it embraces complexity rather than comfort. The names of Scobie, Smith, Resnick, Onizuka, McNair, Jarvis, and McAuliffe are etched into the narrative of spaceflight, not only as symbols of tragedy but as embodiments of human determination. The legacy of Challenger endures not in illusion, but in the lessons learned, the safety reforms enacted, and the enduring commitment to transparency and improvement. To remember them completely is to honor both their ambition and their humanity, acknowledging that progress often advances through painful clarity rather than simplified memory.